we will continue by expanding on this theme within the Czechoslovakia and later also Slovakia with the presentation by Kvet Nguyen, who has graduated in 2021 from the Department of Photography and New Media at the Academy of Fine Arts in Bratislava and is today a doctoral student. She will present part of her dissertation and in her work she deals with the topics of migration, diaspora and their identities and tries to open up discussions about them in ordinary conversations and other platforms as well.
Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to be here and I'm excited to hear all the topics that we have already heard, and I think it kind of connects to my my kind of studies and research that I'm currently doing. Just to maybe give a context, I'm a visual artist working primarily with the medium of photography, and also I'm a PhD candidate, as it was mentioned before. My PhD project and part of it, which can be seen today in transit, was born out of my previous works that kind of regarded my own identity as a Slovak Vietnamese born in the midst of like turbulent times in like Czechoslovakia or Slovakia back then, and where the society was transforming itself from the state socialism toward a more democratic direction. And maybe before I start the research that I was doing, I would maybe talk about just shortly, just to give context, about the works that I have previously done. And the fascination with archives that I have currently started with this picture, and it started in 2020 during COVID, and I was kind of diving myself into archives, and I found this like really broad digital archive of French colonial era in Vietnam. And by that time I just wanted to kind of see the history with the eyes of archive or archival material, and I kind of obsessively went through all the photos from the colonial period. I printed out all the problematic photos on the home printer and tried to correct history in a way, and I kind of came to understand that the photography at this point, that photography was used as a tool of power or propaganda, and this was in the end part of my series called Reframing Possibilities. And with the picture at the beginning and the whole research that followed, I came to understand that that my whole starting point will always be the fact that I am the daughter of Vietnamese migrants, and everything that happened before me affects me. Even the French colonization that I haven't kind of experienced, but it kind of is part of me. Another work that maybe just connects to the research that I'm doing right now is Archive of Returns. It is an open archive of either photographs from family albums that I have found, or the text I have written, or objects that have relevance to the topic. And some of the photographs are from Vietnam, but some of them were created after I started studying at the academy. And I first showed this open box in Čepan Gallery in 2021, and in the interaction with the audience, I found it interesting that people felt that these foreign images are familiar to them, and when asked why, they said that the colors of analog photographs reminded them of theirs, but they did recognize that they haven't seen many pictures of Vietnamese people before. In like context of Slovak history. So this theory kind of proven to be a fact during my PhD research. Everyday life photographs of the Vietnamese community in our context did not appear in news reports or periodicals until '89, and after the Velvet Revolution they appeared rather sporadically. The story of how Vietnamese men and women came to be in Czechoslovakia is also relatively unknown as well. The transnational cooperation between socialist countries has been described by Magda Lipska as a way of spreading the idea of socialism, an attempt to build an anti-colonial internationalism, which was already mentioned here, of course. kind of the internationalism was the way to express solidarity specifically to countries which have long been subjected to foreign exploitation, and Vietnam as a former French colony and consequently after the long-lasting US-Vietnam War was a suitable adapt for this assistance. Leaving war-weary Vietnam for a foreign country was seen as the only possibility of a better future and more secure career when talking about the Vietnamese community. During the research, the beginning of my research, I became an owner of photographs of the first Vietnamese migrants in Czechoslovakia, or like one of the first Vietnamese. The previous owner was a teacher of Slovak language to the Vietnamese students who were fulfilling their mobility that was supposed to provide them mostly with industrial skills. I was kind of fascinated to see, again, photographs of Vietnamese people in Czechoslovakia that are not so common to find. And these are even more interesting by the fact that the photographs were a result of a photo shoot arranged by the Vietnamese people themselves so that they could have a memory of it, and the copy of a memory was given to the teacher that I have mentioned. Her name was Božena Mosná. So at this point, another fascination began for me, and that was community archives and their meaning in contrast to institutional archives. In the contemporary society that is struggling to accept diversity. Institutional archives. When I talk about institutional archives, in my topic we are talking about archives that were created under the then official press agency called ČSTK, today it's TASR, which has an available digital archive. We are talking directly about the period from 1966, when the first Vietnamese people arrived to Czechoslovakia. The story of the Vietnamese community in Czechoslovakia is closely connected with the socialist regime, as I mentioned. The presence of the Vietnamese was conditioned by transnational cooperation, which brought benefits more or less to both sides. In the analysis, I focus on comparing the institutional and unofficial archives, through which I seek an answer to a question: what was the image of the Vietnamese by the majority based on their visual representation, and how did the concept of race enter into it, which allegedly did not exist in the socialist regime? In broader sense, how did the concept of race and thus racism arise in Czechoslovakia? How Vietnamese men and women in Czechoslovakia were portrayed in the media space before the Velvet Revolution can be analyzed thanks to the digitally accessible archives like TASR and Digda, as well as accompanying photographs in magazines and publications. The style of photography did not change under the socialist censorship, and they kept the same strategy throughout all the years of socialism. Vietnamese women in Banská Bystrica, Vietnamese at practice, foreign students, Vietnamese trainees in Košice are the titles of the photographs on the website. And when I first looked at the photo archive of the TASR news agency, I was thrilled since the result of my previous research on the internet were poor. I did not expect the existence of material about the Vietnamese community in a state institution. Such systematically organized material in an official archive confirms that the Vietnamese community has a place in domestic history. The keywords I am inserting into the system are Vietnamese, Vietnamese women, Vietnam, Vietnamese in general, and I am focusing primarily on photographs in this particular archive. In one of the earliest shots from Lubenice, which is this one, we see three men working in an industrial plant. The scene evokes an impression of a building character through the joint work of the hands, and the composition contributes to this by allowing an unknown source of light to penetrate the faces of the workers. It is only by the accompanying description of the photograph that it becomes apparent that the people in the image are of Vietnamese origin. The description equally reveals that the third person is an instructor teaching the Vietnamese in the factory the process of handmade spruce. After a longer and closer look, I come across a kind of stereotype. I get the feeling that the photographs are similar, despite the fact that there is almost 20 years of distance between the previous one and this one. This may have been due to a photographic upbringing that was subject to the propaganda of the ruling Communist Party. The party also nationalized the media legislatively in 1950 and through its offices had oversight of everything. and we know this already. Photography as a medium, just like in the French colonial era, here as well, it was used as a tool of power that could quickly and massively disseminate any ideology for the benefit of the one in control. It was no different under socialism. This is a quote: "The news routine of the 1970s and the 80s brought improvements in the confidential reporting system, tighter control from above, systematic party training, and often staff bullying. The symbol of the period was the agency's central director, Otakar Sverčina, a convinced Stalinist with police-like management methods." End of quote. The people from these images were far from the only authorities who appeared in the photographs with the Vietnamese men and women. Here we can see more of them. This approach, the composition became repetitive. We see master carver Milan Porobovič in Spišská Vela. We see master knitter Marta Sičová in the middle, instructing student Nguyen Biglien alongside her work. Sometimes there were names of the people who are in the picture. And while practicing the basics of sewing, apprentice Nguyen Van Tuan is guided by master trainee Ivan Števko. So Vietnam was perceived as a country that was fighting against the Western powers and as a hardworking nation that wanted to build up its infrastructures and industries in the spirit of socialism. For this reason, the Vietnamese were portrayed as being from a backward country, and in the photographs they were in the position of listeners and learners, indicating a process of development in order to acquire the skills to build a post-war Vietnam. In this way, the regime also legitimized the presence of another nation in a territory against which the public may have been prejudiced. Internationalism, again adopted by Czechoslovakia, was conceived on the basis of equality and anti-racial view of society. And maybe it was also through this strategy that the photographs produced in the period of 67 and 89 could appear uniform. And as you could have seen in the previous pictures, labor was a central motive in the photographs with the Vietnamese. Industrialness was high on the list of values in the society of the time, and therefore anyone who was part of the act of work was worthy of recognition in society. The most effective combination, therefore, was to photograph the apprentices directly in the industrial setting, where they primarily spent their time, set the scene so that they were surrounded by large machines to evoke development, and stage the people dynamically, making it clear that they were working on location and under the supervision of the Czechoslovak authorities. As far as the fraction of shots were where only the learner was present, as like this one, they were placed in the role of an independent worker and did not maintain direct eye contact with the camera. The body language appears modest and unconstrained, and in some of the images the bodies almost blend into the working environment, and visually there is a kind of union with the machines. An example is this one, a 1989 International Women's Day shot depicting Thu Đức Hạnh, who, according to the caption, is a hardy boost in production and successfully exceeds performance standards by more than 40%. In comparison, images without the Vietnamese representation in the same industrial setting within the same time frame have a different character and emotion. For example, the 1975 photo shows a collective of workers in Hliník nad Hronom who managed to save more than 300,000 crowns. The obvious pride and celebration of this achievement is captured as a group tableau photograph with smiles and a direct gaze on the lens and therefore the viewer. We can find a few exceptions in the database that show other place than workspace. In the Tatra archive under the word Vietnamese, there were 4 such photographs in the dormitory area. For example, 1979 photo, 3 men are sitting next to each other. Hoang Van Diao and Bùi Chí Minh are holding guitars, and Phạm Thiệu Thông is watching them and joins them in the singing. The caption to the photograph again explains their presence, specifically giving the information that these days they are completing their studies, having trained for the needs of the Vietnamese national economy. There is also a note highlighting the apprenticeship that contribute to the teaching. The documentation of leisure time, even with an accompanying text appendix, communicates the non-conflicted nature of those photographed, and again contributes explanatory notes about their arrival as well as their departure. The image of Vietnamese community in Czechoslovakia after 89 In the context of societal changes, the transformation of news into independent and free journalism is also taking place. Gone are the days of dictated content, journalists no longer had to justify the stay of foreign workers, and society was equally set on the fact that after a certain period of time, Vietnamese men and women would no longer be encountered on its territory. Photographs with foreign workers with a date later than 89 cannot be found in Tatra database, despite the fact that there were still Vietnamese men and women living in Czechoslovakia who had not managed to complete their mobility. Thus, they remained in an in-between space and faced the decision whether to return home or stay. Journalist and poet Joachim Topol also described the situation in 1991. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, many Vietnamese left for the West, others returned home. Others are seeking asylum in Eastern European countries, some are staying underground. According to an estimate by the editors of the Vietnamese magazine Zan, which is published in Prague, up to 7,000 Vietnamese left the Czechoslovak Republic for the West after the opening of the border, and about 20,000 remain here. Sociocultural anthropologist Christina Schwenkel has written about those who remained as leftover bodies, which is I was inspired by and named the body of work here. And because their decision changed the original plan of return, creating a diaspora that was not originally meant to be. Yes, this I have quoted. Due to the lack of material in Tatra database after 1989, I turned to the second online archive, Digda, where all periodicals published in Slovakia are, and I focus again mainly on the 1990s. Here too, however, the pictorial representation of the community is minimal. In articles with relevant information in relation to the Vietnamese community living in Czechoslovakia, we could count photographs of the Vietnamese people up to 20. They depict, for example, the economic aspect of the community's life. They are snappy photos from the marketplace where, again, we do not see the photographed directly in the eyes of the photographed. This time it is clear from the composition, typical of moments where the photographer has no space to set the scene, that there was no staging or instruction to pose as opposed to the time before 1989. It is also possible that there was no communication between the photographer and the photographed. The author focused on capturing objects representing the atmosphere and space of the market, the merchandise and the market way of laying it out, the cash register and the person behind it. The accompanying text to the photographs mention a concern that a slant-eye quarter is emerging, and specifically under a photograph of a vendor in Večerník, 1992, there is a comment that questions the idea of the Vietnamese businessman as well as the possibility of Slovak citizenship for foreigner nationalities. Like this one, it may sound strange at first glance, but all these guys with the slanted eyes are businessmen, and to top it off, most of them are already equipped with our citizenship. The author, signed only by the initials RH in the article, views the stock market environment with a critical eye. He comments on the typology of the sellers and uses a derogatory description for a Roman man as well. In his words, has his teeth knocked out, and without any innuendo suggests that he is selling a stolen camera. At the end of the article he mentions him once more, but this time calling him a gypsy. Other recurring themes are the lack of reinforcements in the factories that survived, migration without authorized documents, or criminal cases where members of the Vietnamese community have been victims or on occasion culprits. Independent journalism had the space to write objectively about previously unaddressed topics or new issues, although in some cases the objectivity was harder to find, also like this one. The media began to take notice of the increasing numbers of racist attacks, which in 1991, for example, caused 300 Vietnamese asylum seekers to leave for the Netherlands. Joachim Topol noted that the Vietnamese were also verbally attacked in public, especially in Czech cities. I'm looking for the quote. Yes, this one. Prague, Plzeň, Ostrava, Zlín, České Budějovice, as evidenced by a quote from a newspaper entitled Selections from the Domestic and Foreign Press, about a white Czech Republic where Vietnamese in particular are unwelcome. on the subject of racism, I have also discovered highly problematic texts in the archives, including interviews with the group of skinheads, whom similarly xenophobic ideas were quoted. Thus, subliminally, they may have been fueling overt racism not only against the Vietnamese, but also against the Roma or Ukrainian community. I also found a short statement from the Vietnamese side by Nguyen from Trnava. Possibly not here. Our Vietnamese workers are now afraid in Czechoslovakia. Although the situation is quite peaceful in Trnava, it is worse in the Czech Republic, for example. However, there were also attacks in Slovakia, but they were not mediatized. In an interview with the skinheader, the case of the ambush of Vietnamese workers at Istrochem was mentioned. Only the skinheads who ambushed the workers were given space. They said, "We just wanted to remind them by beating them that they were unwanted here." Let me look for the. Yeah, I think that this was the problematizing the media's objectivity or incomplete investigation was mentioned here in this this quote and the article from Topol Yachim, and also in this article where the Vietnamese were on strike and they demanded equal position in the society. So this is how the voice of the Vietnamese community and diasporic archives is being elevated in the media. Attempts at understanding and communication were made. This was precisely at the level of the factories and plants where the Vietnamese negotiators worked during their mobilizations. Working in the factories favored them in terms of relationships. Employers had enough time to get to know the workers and so were able to assess the situation with insight without pigeonholing. As Ladislav Fukari from Slovnaft noted, in my opinion, they need to be looked after more. It is a big disadvantage for this group that they do not have sufficient language skills. Slovnaft published its own publication called Slovnaftar, the weekly newspaper of the workers of Slovnaft Bratislava. It was also in this periodical that the letter of the Vietnamese who defended themselves against the accusation within the framework of the housing culture was published. Another magazine, Hemlon, it was a magazine of the employees of the Hemlon company in Humene, which brought an exceptional and unprecedented reportage from the everyday life of the community, and in this case, the workers at Hemlon. Josef Hruboučák, together with photographer Anton Torma, captured the marriage of Tiandingni and Buithanga. The author describes the wedding atmosphere in detail, also introduces Vietnamese culture. He mentions the Vietnamese calendar, for example, and at the end of the text he wishes a bilingual vignette. In addition to a photo similar to agency shots from before 1989, where a representative of the leadership congratulates the newlyweds, the text is accompanied by a photo of the wedding party enjoying themselves and even an underage girl. Such a photograph is of exceptional significance. Children were never depicted because they were not allowed to be reunited with their families as part of these collaborations. And this first picture of this kind shows us that the Vietnamese decided to settle in Czechoslovakia and that they could imagine life here. Full article. I see this full article as an attempt to bring a specific story outside of work, published by Meridian. It was the fact that it acknowledges the integration of the community into a mainstream society. Unfortunately, I have not found more shots of everyday life in this database within this period. Throughout the growing trend of xenophobic attacks, which transformed after 2000 into hidden prejudices of the majority society and persist against minorities and migrants to this day, it is important to search the diasporic archives. By these I mean family albums created directly by people in the community. The absence of photographs of the community and the aforementioned lack of space for the voice of the community are factors that contribute to stereotyping, ignorance leading to prejudice, and creating a big gap between the last photographs and the present. the Vietnamese community in Slovakia was recognized as an official national minority last year. The media asked about our past, about our arrival, pointing to the fact that we have coexisted for more than 60 years. Thus, the separation of the diaspora from the Slovak population did not allow us to get to know each other and then to be accepted without prejudice. However, both in the Czech Republic and in Slovakia, the children of the first Vietnamese immigrants are growing up. The second and third generations, including myself, have direct contact with the majority of the society from an early age, and the language barrier arises early with the parents. Subsequent generations also open up the question of their identity and history, into which domestic and private archives enter, which in this sense is the only place where the missing voice of the community is heard. Archives of Vietnamese migrants are also beginning to appear in works of foreign art. I will mention, for example, Kvet Nguyen, who sought community archives within her community in her work making of an archive. Individuals and families from various Asian diasporas have offered their photographs for this ongoing project. She called diasporic archives counter-archives, and her definition fundamentally inspired my journey to the everyday photographs I have found home. The anti-archive critically reflects and complements archival funds and historical documents preserved in state institutions. The anti-archive is a testimony about the reality of immigrants, which nuances and disrupt the idealized idea, in our case of socialist internationalism, and the anti-archive is the opposition of the archive constructed by the state and or the opposite of the concept of the archive we are talking about. The confrontation, just to sum up, of official archives through the diasporic archive is a key part of reconstruction of our common history, I mean Czechoslovak and Vietnamese diasporic identity, and the revival of hidden stories that illustrate the missing voice of Vietnamese men and women in Czechoslovakia during the 1990s. For now, the silent voice of anti-archive, the search for one's own identity within the small space that shapes my own memory and our history are important moments in the life of diaspora and young generations trying to balance in a society intolerant to otherness. So that's how I would end it.